Sometimes life strips a man of everything before daring to hand him back a single thread of hope. Daniel Reyes knew that pain all too well. He had buried his wife Margaret just 18 months earlier after a long, merciless battle with cancer. He had lost his steady job when the plant shut down, burned through their savings on hospital bills, and was 3 weeks behind on rent when the phone rang with a voice he never expected. A lawyer. A stranger who said Daniel had inherited something from a grandfather he had never even known existed. Not money, not land, but a cemetery, an entire graveyard in a town called Milbrook, Connecticut. It sounded more like a cruel joke than salvation, but Daniel had no other options. So he packed up his 10-year-old son, Leo, and drove their rattling Honda Civic north, chasing a flicker of possibility in the middle of despair. For Daniel, it was not just about keeping a roof over their heads. It was about trying to give his son something resembling stability after too much loss. Yet as the town of Milbrook came into view with its postcard-perfect steeples and white fences, Daniel felt a shiver he couldn't explain. Something about the place seemed frozen in time, as if untouched since the 1950s. Leo leaned against the window, wide-eyed, asking if they were really going to live in a graveyard. Daniel corrected him gently, next to it in the caretaker's cottage. Still, the truth was undeniable. They were about to begin their new life among the dead, and nothing about it would be simple. The caretaker's cottage was old but solid, weathered stone wrapped in ivy, sitting at the edge of Willowbrook Cemetery like a watchman's post. The townsfolk seemed kind enough on the surface, but whispers traveled quickly. Some warned Daniel that strange things had always surrounded the graveyard. He brushed it off as superstition. After all, what could be stranger than the life he had already endured? Yet the first nights in that cottage carried an unsettling stillness, too quiet as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Then came the storm, a violent green-sky tempest that ripped through Milbrook with biblical force, toppling trees and scattering branches across headstones. When the rain finally cleared, Daniel and Leo stepped outside to survey the damage. That's when they saw it. A massive oak had collapsed near the far edge of the cemetery, tearing open the ground and shifting an old monument. Beneath its cracked foundation, hidden away for nearly a century, were stone steps leading down into darkness. Against every fatherly instinct, Daniel let his son's curiosity pull them closer. With flashlights and rope, they descended into a chamber carved into bedrock itself. It wasn't a burial vault. It was a vault of another kind. Wooden crates, metal strongboxes, dusty, untouched air. And inside those containers lay artifacts, Civil War photographs, Native American pottery, Victorian jewelry, and documents of staggering historical value. Leo's small hands trembled with excitement, and Daniel's heart pounded with something heavier, fear. Because as they pieced together the markings, they realized these weren't forgotten family heirlooms. They were treasures stolen from the Milbrook Historical Museum in 1924, a theft so infamous it had shuttered the museum forever. And now somehow, those missing millions sat in his hands. For days, Daniel couldn't sleep. The chamber's contents weren't just priceless, they were radioactive. Whoever had stolen them nearly a century ago had buried their crime deep, and someone in this town had made sure it stayed that way. In the crates, Daniel found a Victorian mourning locket that froze his blood. The woman's face inside bore a haunting resemblance to his late wife, Margaret. Her name, engraved on the back, was Mary Elizabeth Whitmore, a teacher who had supposedly died in the 1923 influenza outbreak. But something about the coincidence gnawed at him. Was this just a trick of genetics, or was there a deeper connection between Margaret and this town's buried past? He went to the local library with Leo, where the head librarian, Agnes Cole, recognized the woman instantly. Mary Elizabeth had been beloved in Milbrook until her sudden death, and she was Eleanor Whitmore's niece, the very family whose headstone had cracked open to reveal the chamber. But Agnes dropped hints Daniel couldn't ignore. His grandfather Harold had spent decades quietly researching this family, haunted by secrets he never shared. It was Harold who had mapped anomalies beneath the cemetery, Harold who had hidden documents, Harold who seemed to know too much about a robbery that had never been solved. The picture was becoming clear. This wasn't an innocent inheritance. It was a legacy, a burden, and maybe even a curse. The storm had torn open one vault, but Harold's meticulous notes revealed there were more. Markings on a hand-drawn cemetery map led Daniel and Leo to other hiding places, including a sealed strongbox buried near the Whitmore mausoleum. Inside were letters written by Mary Elizabeth herself, and these letters changed everything. They weren't the writings of a dying schoolteacher. They were the desperate words of a woman who had uncovered the truth about the 1924 robbery. She had tracked the movements of Milbrook's most powerful men, Mayor Blackwood, Sheriff Brady, Judge Foster, and others, tying them directly to the museum's stolen treasures. Her last letter was dated just 3 days before her supposed death from influenza, and in it she admitted she feared for her life. Suddenly, the resemblance to Margaret no longer felt like coincidence. Daniel realized Mary Elizabeth hadn't died of the flu at all. She had been silenced. Worse still, the evidence suggested his own grandfather, Harold Reyes, had been a terrified 20-year-old caught in the conspiracy, coerced into helping hide what was stolen. Guilt had kept him tethered to that cemetery until the day he died. And now, unknowingly, Daniel and Leo had stepped into the same storm Harold had been trying to outlast for 70 years. The deeper Daniel dug, the more dangerous things became. Among Harold's papers, he uncovered a banker's ledger that named names and amounts, bribes paid to town officials to look the other way. Each entry linked stolen artifacts to corrupt leaders. But as soon as Daniel held those pages, the past reached forward to remind him that Milbrook's power was still intact. A black sedan rolled up the cemetery drive, and out stepped Mayor Richard Blackwood, grandson of the very man Mary Elizabeth had accused in her letters. With him was Sheriff Tom Brady and a private enforcer. Their smiles were warm, their tone polite, but their message was ice-cold. Whatever Daniel found beneath the cemetery belonged to the town, and outsiders were wise not to disturb history. That night, Agnes warned him over the phone that his family might already be in danger, and she was right. The cemetery felt less like sacred ground and more like a chessboard, every move being watched. Leo, usually full of childlike wonder, asked his father if they were going to do the right thing even if it was dangerous. Daniel promised him they would, but inside he wondered if he had just promised his son a fight they couldn't possibly win. The truth of Harold's life became unbearable when Agnes delivered Dr. James Morrison's lost journal. Morrison, the museum's original director, had spent decades documenting the cover-up of his collection's theft, naming the same families that still controlled Milbrook today. His notes confirmed what Daniel feared. Harold had been present during the robbery, but looked more like a prisoner than an accomplice. Morrison believed Harold had stayed behind out of guilt, preserving evidence so that someday someone else could finish what he could not. That someday had arrived, but Milbrook's elite were not about to let it happen. Blackwood, Brady, and Morrison's own descendants came knocking at Daniel's door, offering to buy out the cemetery and free him from his burdens. It was no offer. It was a threat. Daniel refused. The men left with forced smiles, but their eyes said something darker. This would not end politely. Agnes urged Daniel to take the evidence out of town and deliver it to the State Historical Society, where federal authorities could intervene. But even as he agreed, Daniel knew they were being watched. Every shadow near the cemetery, every car slowing down on the road, carried the weight of menace. Still, he copied every page, photographed every item, and prepared to take the fight beyond Milbrook's borders. The final straw came when Leo stumbled upon a false wall in the cottage basement. Behind it, Harold had hidden his last cache, more letters, more ledgers, and one chilling revelation. Mary Elizabeth had been actively investigating the conspiracy right up until her death. She had proof of meetings between the mayor and known Chicago mobsters, and she had documented that Daniel Reyes was being used as a pawn. Her last words, scrawled in desperation, admitted she feared she would not survive to tell the truth. Reading those letters aloud, Leo's small voice trembled. "Dad, what if we're the last chance to get justice for her?" Daniel held his son and realized that was exactly what Harold had hoped. That one day his bloodline would carry the truth forward, no matter the cost. That night, Daniel double-locked every door, pulled the curtains, and prepared copies of everything for transport to Hartford. He knew they were racing the clock. The Blackwoods, the Bradys, and the Morrisons had kept their grip on Milbrook for a century. They would not let go without a fight. And Daniel also knew the most terrifying part. The real danger was what lay buried in the cemetery. It was the living men outside his door. By dawn, Daniel made his choice. He and Leo loaded the car with evidence, journals, photographs, and copies, bound for the State Historical Society in Hartford. As they drove past the cemetery's iron gates, Daniel felt Harold's presence, not as a ghost, but as a guardian, finally releasing his burden. The fight ahead would be long. Federal agents would need to verify the artifacts, prosecutors would need to unravel a century of corruption, and powerful families would surely strike back. But for the first time since Margaret's death, Daniel felt purpose instead of despair. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was standing up for truth, for justice, and for his son's future. Leo sat beside him, eyes bright with determination, whispering, "We're doing the right thing, Dad." And Daniel knew he was right. The road stretched ahead, uncertain and dangerous, but it also glowed with possibility. This was no longer about stolen treasure. It was about exposing lies, protecting the innocent, and giving voice to the dead who had been silenced for far too long. If you've stayed with me through this journey, you know this isn't just a story. It's a reminder that sometimes ordinary people are called to fight extraordinary battles. And if you believe in truth, in justice, and in the power of storytelling, then make sure you subscribe right now. Because tomorrow, I have another story that will shake you just as deeply. Until then, remember, some secrets are too important to stay buried.